Hey everyone, you're listening to the Active Turnkey podcast, a podcast designed for hands-off, passive real estate rental investors. In the Active Turnkey podcast, you'll hear Tom Olson and Jared Stotemeister discuss all things turnkey rentals with other turnkey providers, service providers, and rental investors. Our goal is to help you reach your financial freedom and whatever comes after that. Let's go. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Active Turnkey podcast. I'm your host, Jared Stotemeister, and I have with me Tom Olson, and he usually joins me on these.
I'm here today. I made it. Mm-hmm. We're here in Northwest Indiana. It's a little chilly.
It is. Low is 15 this morning.
Ooh, was it that cold?
Yeah.
I did not remember it being that cold.
It was frigid.
I don't mind the 20s. I really don't. People are like, oh, it's so cold up there.
No.
Most of the winter up here, it is in the 20s.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get colder. So, But the other 10 months, it's not that cold.
It's not. And actually, we only have about
And this is a weather
weeks.
forecast that we're giving you guys at the Active Turnkey podcast.
We're just letting you know how it is.
Maybe
here.
we could get a sponsor for the show that gives us the weather
channel
or something.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe.
Tom Skilling here in Chicagoland.
The dew point.
Barometer readings and stuff like that. We woke up nice and cold this morning, but here we're still here and we're still doing podcasts apparently.
It's nice and warm in the studio today.
It is toasty,
yes.
and I'm wearing my sweater, so we'll see how it goes for this. So
it's going to be a really short podcast because Jared's going to start stinking really fast.
Really fast. It's bad. So just beware. I don't know, but we're here for another podcast, and today it's a little bit off our normal general learning and discussion because like everything else, things are changing, right? And our podcast today is going to be a little bit about how to react to what's happening through some COVID restrictions and changes. And
if there's one thing that's constant, it seems like it's change.
Correct.
So you either have to change with it, you have to figure it out as it comes, or you end up not being a good steward.
No, that's a good point. I mean, I think in many cases, the basics seem to always be the same when it comes to turnkey rentals. We've been selling them for a while, and the copy that you would read on Bigger Pockets is going to be, you look for this, and this, and you want this, and this. But with COVID, it's changed things, and it's really had to make you ask questions. And from a property manager's perspective, we want to make sure that how are we taking care of our clients and being proactive. And so one of the things we would want to talk about is how COVID has changed rental agreements, lease agreements in 2021.
Yeah, I think it's a good discussion. It's a good topic to kind of think through. And in the future here, me and Jared already talked today about maybe having an accountant on as well. And, obviously we have a new president, and, with a new president comes a new administration, comes new initiatives that they want to push. Again, I'm not here to be on one side of the aisle or the other side, but I will say, it does look like there's going to be some changes coming forward. And so we'll probably have my accountant, who is probably, I think, one of the best accountants in the country when it comes to understanding real estate and understanding real estate investors and how to make sure that you best prepare for that, Josh Belk. And, so just look out for that coming up here in the future, a podcast on so now we're talking about the actual lease agreements, how to deal with tenants, how to make sure that maybe some key changes that we are doing in our own lease agreements, and maybe even the vetting process we can get into.
Sure.
Some things that we're doing now that we weren't doing a year ago.
Right.
And honestly, I really believe it's helped our company. We've been very proactive on some of these changes. We didn't just stick our head in the sand, and I really have to give our property manager a big credit for that. We do meet quarterly and have big initiatives, and then we meet weekly as well. And then the teams meet daily, really, and just make changes on the fly sometimes, because it almost seems like some of these changes that are happening right now are happening from week to week. And even I talked to Cheryl yesterday, and she said that sometimes it's like the judges don't even know what direction they're going to go, and they get a new memo the next week, and now there's something that's a little bit different. And it's funny because we've even seen an ebb and flow from judges. Some judges the one week will say one thing, and the next week they said no, they changed something, and then the next week they'll say no, I misunderstood it, it's this instead of that. And so I mean, as confused as you are, the people that are listening, and I think sometimes we're confused, but it's encouraging to know that even the people that are supposed to be ruling and judging are also confused. So if you want to confuse people, just add more government, right? Isn't that kind
it
of
solves problems?
It's one of those. It's one of those things. If you want to be more confused, add more government.
Sure.
They can spend more money than anybody else. They can confuse you, and they can create a 5,600 page document that will basically give you 10 laws that they probably could have done on one piece of paper.
So we've touched on weather.
So yeah, we've
now
definitely
we went
taken
through politics and such, government
things that you're never supposed to talk about, right?
We'll talk about religion here next.
Yes,
I'm kidding.
Definitely have
I'm
to get
kidding.
into religion next.
Yeah, definitely. No. So again, like Tom's saying, from a property management perspective, you have to change things. You just can't. You can't. You have to be able to respond, and then you have to put it in the process, and do it over and over again. So there has to be current, changes and adjustments, and so yes, I'm definitely excited about the opportunity. So let's jump in. So typically, from a lease agreement standpoint, from a turnkey provider, there are small variations depending on when we place a tenant, so that may actually lengthen a lease. But typically speaking, you're going to buy a property that has a year lease in place. Most people are accustomed to a year lease. And
1 year lease, a 2 year lease, even a 3 year lease
Sure.
to a certain degree. If you go over 3 years, I think it becomes a different kind of contract in Indiana. So we don't go longer than 3 years. I actually think it has to be less than 3 years. So the longest contract we would ever want to do in Indiana would be 2 years and 364 days. So that's the longest that we would want to do in Indiana, at least from our legal, from our attorney's advice. And a lot of times, buying a turnkey rental property, if I'm an investor and I'm buying maybe not in my market, I typically want that in place. I want some kind of security. I want a contract in place. I know at the end of the day, if a tenant moves out in the middle of that, they break their lease, even though like the old school way of thinking is you could actually go after them for all of that lease. And I think there's actually some people in the world that still think that. Practicality, the practical side of that says you're probably not going to get the money. The judge is probably not going to rule in that favor if it goes to court and you actually like sue for damage. You're probably not going to get the rest of that lease. But I think it's still I think it's good to have the agreement, the expectation that this person's going to stay at least 1 year. And for me, for the most part, if you ask me, what is your preference, Tom? My preference is probably somewhere between that 1 and 2 year lease, and then renewing that lease every 1 to 2 years. I will just be honest with you. For us, we don't like leases ending in December. It's kind of a big no-no for us. Like I never start a lease where it ends in December.
Right.
Even November, from November 15th to January 15th.
Yep.
I don't want any. So those 2 months worth of time, I never will create a lease knowing it's going to end then.
Yeah.
I don't care even if they're signing up in December. I will then make it a 14-month lease or a 16-month lease. I don't want a lease to end there. Really, because, most people, it doesn't matter where you live, don't want to move around Thanksgiving, around Christmas, around New Year's. And so, if you just think of it from just that perspective, it just doesn't make sense. And most tenants gladly agree because they're like, yes, absolutely, I don't want they don't want their lease ending then either. Because people are busy. It's a very busy time of year. For us and from our perspective, you also have in certain states, especially the northern states, they will have rent. I don't know, memorandums. They call it different things, but basically, in a lot of states, you can't even evict somebody in December because of the holidays, because of winter-ish type of. It's kind of interesting because they blame it on winter, but it's actually colder here in February than most of the time in December. But you can evict people in February, so I think it's just what people want to call it. But I think it's more. If you ask me. I think from a landlord perspective and an owner's, I think it's just good business. It's really is. Yep. So that's our process to begin with. I like a year lease. A lot of our contracts are longer than a year. We do like the 2 year leases as well, but sometimes we'll do 2.5 years or 2 years and 3 months. And it keeps people locked in for a longer period of time. So that's normally what we would do, right?
Yeah.
But with COVID, one of the biggest issues that we've had is evictions. So you know that there is the stipulations about you cannot. So basically, in the CDC agreement right now, and I know we're talking about maybe extending what's going on right now and all of the referendums they have right now for rents, evictions, to extend these out to August, September, I don't even know, October, who knows. I mean, one of my questions, Jared, is when is this going to be over? Can you answer that for me?
I cannot, unfortunately. I have that in my notes.
Well, Jared,
as well.
I just need a prediction on camera.
I have
so
this in
we
my
can,
notes as well.
Can you give us a prediction on camera so we can come back and tell everybody how right you were or how wrong you were?
Being right is not important to me. It's just not.
You heard it here, folks. Being right is not important.
I don't need to be that guy.
To Jared, he doesn't want to go on record.
Not on this
I
one.
wanted to make sure I asked that question because I thought Jared might ask me that question. I didn't want him to ask me that question because I didn't want to answer that question either. So, because I mean, the way I'd answer that question is who knows.
It depends.
I don't
That's how you
know.
would answer.
To me, why we're still in the situation that we're in now, why we are still, letting people stay in properties without having to pay is beyond me. Especially if they're not even willing to go and do what the CDC has required them to do. There's a lot of discussion. We do have a couple points, to kind of point out, about the whole issue. But like for us, for instance, and I'm sure if it's this way for us, it's probably this way for other places as well. There are two main judges in Lake County that you stand in front of. Now in Porter County or LaPorte County, it doesn't really matter who you stand before of. They pretty much have the same stance. And it's interesting because in Porter County and LaPorte County, like those judges don't mess around. It's like, oh, you didn't fill out the CDC form? Okay, you're going to be evicted. If you didn't do all the stipulations that the CDC says, the judges are very firm by the letter of the law, by what the law says, and they actually follow it. That's a concept. I mean, it's what a concept. I don't know. A judge actually will go by what the law says.
Fair enough.
And so basically, I think, to kind of give, I'm trying not to give legal advice here, and I think that is something to kind of, point out as a little bit more in this particular episode, is that we're not attorneys. I'm only telling you what we do, and I'm kind of giving you the reason about why we do it from an investor's perspective and from a property manager's perspective, not necessarily telling you what you should do. And I would say, before we go any farther, to make sure that you do consult your attorney
every time
with any kind of legal advice or anything that would have to do. But when it comes to our evictions, our experience has been in Porter and LaPorte County, as long as the tenant does have a hardship. First of all, they're supposed to prove that they have a hardship.
Correct.
You're not supposed to be able to continue having a job and continue everything and just get out of paying rent. That's not what the intent of the CDC guideline is.
The spirit of it. Yep.
So that's not the spirit. That wasn't the intent. Just to be clear, at least that's how I read it. I mean, maybe you can interpret it differently. Maybe your attorney may interpret it different. But me and my attorney, this is how we interpret it. And this is how the judges, for some reason, in LaPorte and Porter County have seemed to interpret it. So they're supposed to, number one, prove that there's a hardship. Number two, they're also supposed to prove that they actually have applied for work. What a concept. Number three, they're actually supposed to fill out the CDC form. And number four, they're also supposed to have, and we actually did a podcast about this. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, we actually had our attorney on. So you guys can actually listen to our attorney. And he kind of went through these 4 or 5 steps that they are supposed to, the tenant, the resident is supposed to do before the judge says, okay, you don't have to pay rent. You cannot be evicted. And that 4th or 5th thing, wherever I'm at, whatever number I'm on, basically means that they also have to apply for assistance, because the states have assistance money that they've gotten in the different, CARES Act, and then the second act, and now we're probably going to have, I don't know how many bundles of money that are going to be out there for different assistance for this. And that's a whole other topic that we won't get on today. So there is money for these tenants, and the tenants have and something that we've been very proactive. I'm actually really proud about this. We just talked about this in our quarterly meeting with our property management company. Is that I know we're as proactive as we possibly could be to help our tenants get that money. And if you think about it, it's not just the tenants that are going to end up with the money; it's the owners that are going to end up with the money.
Sure.
So if I'm going to be a good steward of my owners, like I want to help number one, you're helping the tenant, which I think is community, it's helping. And number two, I want to also help the owners to be able to have that. So if you don't have a property manager that is not doing that, just so you know, they can help, they can assist, and there's a lot of assistance out there still you may not get full rent. Trust me, they doesn't mean that they don't owe it. They still owe the rent, and some of the tenants will pay all of it. Some of it will pay some of it. Some of them might not pay any of it. But it is something that will, at least help maybe pay the mortgage or at least maybe, help it. So those particular properties, you don't lose as much money on. I will say out of the almost 300 properties that we're managing now, we don't have too many. We have about 13 or 14 that have gotten some kind of assistance. So that's not a massive, it's not a huge amount of, to me, that's not a lot. They have gotten some assistance, and some of those are paying in full. Some of those are paying some, and some of those are paying none. So I think in addition to that, we just looked at this morning, we had 4 properties that nobody's paying nothing. So that they haven't done this. The judges have let them off scot-free. They haven't applied for assistance. They won't even let us help them apply for assistance. So, and I'm not trying to, brag and boast about our things. I just know that you can. I want to encourage people that you can get, most of your rent now. And most tenants, honestly, 85-90% of tenants don't have any issues with it all. They've continued to keep their jobs. They've paid their rent on time, and that's what you'd like to see anyway. So
that's a good question. I mean, kind of tying into what you just said, if you have a property manager who hasn't done things great, but you want to ask them in that situation, well, what are you doing? Or you could be asking, if you don't have a property in that situation, you could ask, in the event that this happens, what are you doing? Like, what steps do you take when a tenant decides to stop paying, or if there's a reason for stop paying? Some of them are completely legitimate. So what are the steps taken? You should know what your property manager is doing, and they should be able to spell that out for you. And so that shouldn't be an issue. If they're not, then that should be a problem, and you should let them know that first.
And some property managers don't even probably know, or they weren't, they didn't have the initiative to try to help people. Yeah,
I was actually at a basketball tournament recently and ran into an old friend of mine who works with a property manager closely, and he didn't even have an idea of what that was, of the assistance, which I was shocked by, actually.
So I want everybody to know all this before we kind of get into kind of the big question of this podcast, which is kind of like, do I go month to month? There's a lot of talk out there. I've been on some webinars where there are some attorneys recommending it. Some attorneys aren't. There's pros and cons to the month to month. There's reasons to do the month to month and reasons to just stick with the normal plan. In today's podcast, we're going to kind of try to get into some of those things. So, Jared, what do you think off the top of your mind? When you think, I forgot about my judges. I forgot about talking about my judges. So, I'm sorry, we're going to rewind here. So we're going to go back to the judges. We talked about we talked about Porter and LaPorte County, but in Lake County, it's like you've got one judge that's pretty standard on the law of the land. He's still a little bit lenient, but he is still kind of going on the law of the land. And then there's another judge where it doesn't really matter. Right. Like, he will let them fill out the CDC form in court, which you're not supposed to be allowed to do. So I think some of this matters about where you're at, what cities you're in, what counties you're in, who the judges are that are actually judging on how you want to change your agreements. At least that's in my mind. That's what I'm thinking. Sure. So just kind of back to the judges, I think when we get into this month to month, do you want to go month to month or do you want to go year? I think there is some wisdom in that.
Absolutely. And so that is a great, if you're not having an issue in where you're located, it's probably not something you have to make some major changes. You should be having the conversation. You should be asking the questions. But if you're not having an issue with doing that, then don't worry about it. However, one thing we do know in our area is that with a lease in place, it's a lot more difficult to get the tenant out. In fact, it's very difficult. But
to that point, what has been consistent, it seems like, with all judges, at least in our area, is for the most part, the one thing that you cannot evict somebody for is non-payment. So that's what brings us into this month to month.
Correct.
Versus maybe, the standard 1 year, 2 year, 3 year lease is because what we have seen so far is if the leases have expired and we are just not renewing a lease, then at that point, if somebody doesn't want to leave, and when you have to go to court and evict them, you can. And it seems like consistently, I can't tell you 100%, but I think in most cases we have seen us be able to evict bad tenants or bad tenants that aren't paying their rent based on the fact that the lease has expired. So if you think about it, a month-to-month lease literally expires every month. And there are terms in a lease agreement for month-to-month that will tell you, what the terms are. Like, so for instance, most month-to-month leases that I know of, and I think ours is like this, would say, at any given time, either party can give a 30-day or a 60-day notice, and then at that point, the lease is over and they can vacate. And different states are different, so don't again, Indiana's going to be different. There's going to be some states might require a 60-day notice. Some states may require a 30-day notice. Maybe some states only require a 15-day notice. I don't know. I think 30 days is a little bit more standard from my understanding. So that kind of brings us into this whole topic of, hey, do we want to go month to month? Do we want to go, do we want to continue our plan? And me and Jared have had many conversations, and I just don't have a super strong opinion on this. I do have an opinion, and I think it's almost a case by case basis.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you. And in fact, if you even go deeper, we were talking through this, and one of the things you have is when it's case by case, you're basing it off information. Did the tenant, what was their record like throughout the time of their lease when they did have a job? Did they pay on time? How did they communicate with you? Did they cause you problems? Were they difficult to deal with? These are questions that you would probably ask anyway when you're up for the new lease, but even more so at this point in time, it's just exponentially bigger because you just don't know what tomorrow holds, and when something happens at that point, what is their track record like? So as opposed to when you put a tenant in where you don't have that information, in this case, when you have a renewal of a lease, it does give you more power. You have personal
experience with that particular person.
Correct.
But I think you also bring up a good point because it's almost like normally you put a magnifying glass on that. That's what you said. Normally you do that anyways. But now it's almost like you got to really put a magnifying glass on. It's like magnifying the magnifying glass.
Right.
But I want to also make this statement because I think this is very important when it comes to making a decision like this. Let's go back to you don't have that information. You don't have that one-on-one experience with that particular person, right? So what if it is a new tenant? So if it's a brand new resident, a brand new person coming into your property, what are some things that you could do now to help you make that determination whether you wanted to go month to month or whether you wanted to go with a typical year or 2-year lease?
Well, one of the things we know right now is, and this is all information, so learning is so important, is gain the knowledge. So one thing we know right now is because you can't evict, naturally that means that these evictions aren't going to be on people's records. So when people are applying for your property, they're not going to have an eviction on their record, and they may have a glowing application. Their credit may qualify, their income ratio may qualify. They may not have any other issues that may pop up. They don't have a criminal record and things like that. So at that point, you're looking, hey, this is a qualified tenant. And unfortunately, they may have not paid rent for the last 6 months. And so that's just the nature of things. And so knowing that, one thing that OPS, also Property Services, has been actively doing is they've been asking for the last 3 months of paid receipts from their previous landlord, and then they've gone and asked them. And what it's done is it's really done a few things. First of all, some people opt out right away. They just opt out themselves.
Why would they do that?
Odds are they either found another one a house they really wanted.
That's what it was, Jared.
Or or a little birdie in their mind said, you know what, I think they're on to our game. And
I'm on to you.
Yeah.
Let's
So
see.
instead of going through the whole process and being shocked at the end, they would.
Well, it's interesting because I do know, and this only happened to us one time. So we have been doing this, and I've been recommending this to people since last April. Like, you've got to be way more proactive on that front end to vet that tenant. And now, if you do a really great job of vetting that new person coming in, like, I mean, my feeling is that it probably doesn't matter that much. Like, if you found a really good tenant, they're probably going to pay. And you're not going to have to worry about this. So you can go year, you can go month to month. It doesn't really matter. And I do think there are some reasons to have a year lease in place. And one of the biggest reasons for people to want to have a year lease in place is some banks, when you're going when you're going to finance a property, that's a requirement. So it's a requirement for some banks to actually have a year lease on a property if you're going to get a loan based on the rental income of that property.
Especially not at will or month to month.
Exactly. They want to have a lease in place that is going to go for a period of time and not to. So now maybe banks are going to get wind and be wise and maybe not have that as a requirement temporarily. I don't know. But in the past, that has been one of the biggest reasons why I would say, hey, if you're going to finance this property, maybe you probably do want to put the year lease and just be really good and really put that magnifying glass on that tenant. And one of those things, like Jared just said, and I think probably the biggest thing that we've done is to change that specific part of our process. We are verifying the last 3 months of their rent history payment. And like you said, is it something that we can require that they have to do? Absolutely not. Right. But it is our 100%. Like, we are still vetting. Like, we can approve or not approve for any reason other than the typical approval thing. So obviously, it has nothing to do with race or religion, or that has nothing to do with that. It's a qualification process, and as long as it's put in your process, our attorney has told us that this is completely fine for us to do. So, so with that being said, to me, like, that's a very, and we've only had that I know of. We've had a couple people like maybe just opt out and not even but we had one person throw a stink about it, and we were just like, well, that's fine. You don't have to give it to us. There's no big, we're not going to have our feelings hurt, and you can say what you want to say, but at the end of the day, this is what our process is, and it's what our process is going to be going forward, because I have to protect the interests of my owner, and it's very important for us to want to think that way and talk that way. So again, that's something that we have done up front, and I think it's important because I think it's important to talk about, because if you don't do that process, well, I mean, then maybe fine. Then you might want to lean more towards that month to month. If you don't have a good vetting process, if you don't pull their criminal report and their background check, and if you don't have a evictions report, and you don't pull their credit report, and you don't ask them if they've got like, for instance, I have a friend of mine who is a lender, and she found one of the persons that was trying to borrow money from her had like 15 parking tickets, and they asked him about that, and they were like, well, these are 15 unpaid parking tickets. What in the world is going on? And he was like, well, I just don't like following their rules. And they were like, well, we have rules. So it's the same type of deal. Like, people can't just opt out of something and not want to, those tenants. Like, and honestly, part of the vetting process for us is even like, how are they communicating with us? Sure. Are they communicating with us in a professional manner, or is this somebody that we want to work with in the future? Is this somebody that is going to be helpful? That's going to fulfill their end of the bargain.
It's a form of underwriting,
in
more
a way,
or less.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. And one thing that to kind of circle back on, because a lot of our investors are really growing their portfolios, some of our investors have filled up their Fannie Mae slots. They've hit their 10 or 20 slots of the Fannie Mae, and now they're going commercial with their financing, and the commercial lenders absolutely require a lease. They do not allow the month to month. They certainly want a lease in place. They can't have a vacant property. They won't fund a vacant property.
Because the commercial lenders are actually using
Right.
the income from the properties to partly vet the actual asset itself and the actual loan. So again, like you have to think of all these different things.
Right.
So if you're filling a property right now, I will say, so we did talk about a reason for going month to month. I mean, for going year lease. Yep. So let's talk about a reason to go month to month. And I'll just give you a real life example of something that we're going through right now ourselves personally. We just purchased a package of rentals, and it was 100% occupied so every single property was occupied, and we bought them at will. They were all month to month leases, and we bought them all at will. So naturally, our company wants to go out and we want to get new leases put in place with these tenants. Even though they're month to month, we want our agreement.
Right.
We want our attorney that has vetted our deals, that in the future, if we ever do have to have any kind of issues with them, we want our attorney to be able to stand by the verbiage and the language in the the lease that he has helped draft. So with that being said, in the next month or so, we will have new leases drawn up. And we have made the agreement that we are not even going to offer. We're not going to, we're going to continue this month to month, because part of our process would be if they don't want to go month to month and if they want to move out or opt out of this whole deal, that's fine by us, because some of the properties need some repairs. And at that point, we would go in and remake those repairs. And a lot of these properties are under rent, so they're rented for less than what market rent would be. And at that point, after we made the repairs, we would then be able to raise the rent to market rents. So, like, again, if you're in a situation, sometimes it depends on the situation that you're in. I think I have a hard stance. So I have two hard stances. The rest, I think, is all subjective. It's all like that doesn't. I don't know. You have to kind of make a case by case. But if you're inheriting somebody else's tenant, somebody else's property manager that you don't know and you don't have any history with, I probably have a really strong lean towards the month to month. If I'm going to go out and get commercial lending and I know that it's going to require a long-term lease, then I'm going to lean really heavy towards making sure that long-term lease. So to me, I mean, obviously there's some pros and cons. We've talked about that quite a bit. We've already talked about some reasons why you may want to go month to month. Is there any other reasons, Jared, that you can think of that you've heard of month to month versus year or 2 year?
Well, it's not necessarily into the month to month, year to year, but one thing did come up recently for us because we have been buying more occupied properties that we plan to do our normal rehabs on and so on. One thing that has come up, and because we do know some of you investors don't buy from Olsen Group, you may be buying from your own communities and what have you.
Absolutely, lots of them.
So one thing that we've caught is, again, you mentioned the inherited tenant with the inherited lease. Now, so what happens is if you acquire a property and naturally when you're vetting a property and you're vetting an occupied property, you should be asking for your classic lease. You should be asking for the rent rolls. You want to know, are they paying? Same thing that we've just been talking about. However, one thing that could become an issue is if you did not get the application at the time of the sale.
That's true.
Now, your property manager, especially if you bring one to Cheryl, for instance, if you bring her one and you don't have that application, it's going to make it very difficult for them to find that tenant because they don't have a social, they don't have a forwarding address, all that information. So that's definitely something, if you're going to acquire a property that's occupied with an inherited tenant, you want to make sure that you not only get the lease, but you also get the application. And so that's recently we've added that to our process because we've been aggressively buying occupied properties now. So what do we have to do? We have to add that to our vetting process, that not only do we need lease and rent rolls, but we also need to have the application.
A new application, absolutely.
Correct.
So that's a great thing to add, and I know that wasn't part of the lease,
Correct.
but it is it does apply to this, and that application serves many purposes. So just make sure if you're a newbie investor and if you're going to rent your own property or you're going to rent something for the first time and you're listening to this podcast, make sure you have an attorney help you with your lease. Make sure you have an attorney help you with your application. Make sure you take your whole process and write it down and tell your attorney this is what we're doing. Make sure you let him know what things you can and cannot do, what things you can and cannot say. All those things are very, very important to have that legal advice. But understand that you want to save that application. You want to save that those things are very important to relate, things to have in the future. And there's much more that are important, as well, like all the communication that you have with them and like, payment history and all that stuff. It needs to be properly documented. Right. But as far as it comes to the lease, program and leasing process, we are changing all of our. We're in the middle of changing our upfront process. We made these changes and these policies, but we kind of haven't put them in the process. I mean, we're doing it, but it hasn't been written in the process. Right, yeah. Let me say it that way. So we've been acting this way. We've been, it's been our process, but we haven't actually rewritten our process. So it's something that we're even writing into our process now, and we might even have to change it back once, if this is ever over. I keep scratching my head, and then also, we've also even had to change our eviction process. So there's many more steps that need to be added to the back end as well when it comes to all this. So, hopefully that's a lot of value for people today, and at least we'll understand our mindset. Again, I'm not trying to give legal advice. I'm just trying to, just tell people my thoughts and kind of what we're doing. And I think I believe it's working as well as we can possibly, think that it would work. I haven't heard of any other, honestly, I haven't even heard of any other property managers that have been doing better. And I also think that, honestly, I think we've been given a gift because of the area that we're in, and our unemployment never even went above 7%. Who knows if that's going to get worse next, throughout 2021. We don't really know what the future holds, but we can continue to just change and adapt with what we have to deal with today.
Absolutely, I agree. Because we don't know. We can say the sky is falling. We could have a cup half full and say things are going to get better, but we just don't know that information. But what we do know, we should be responsible for, and we should be tracking that information and making changes in the processes. And again, this is not a normal time. And I agree with you. I think in the end, most investors would love to have that year and a half to 2 year lease. But that's just not for today in some certain circumstances. So you have to make the adjustment in different areas. But again, I think, like Tom said, know your area, know your numbers, and know your tenants. And then from there, you'll be able to really get some things done. So we hope this podcast brought you value. And just to remind you guys, we do build rental portfolios for investors. So if you're looking to get started into turnkey rentals, or you're already in one market and you're looking to get into another one, we'd be definitely interested in helping you do that. You can reach out to us at jared@buyolsongroup.com. We also are putting out a new website here momentarily at buyolsongroup.com. You can go there and get on our list.
And that's BUY. So we know everybody eventually that's listening to this podcast is at one point going to think, hey, I want to buy from Olson Group.
Sure,
right? So
naturally.
BUYOLSON, not EN, OLSON group.com. So buyolsongroup.com. Get on our turnkey list and see what kind of properties we might have available for you. And we also have the Active Turnkey book. So I wrote a book called Active Turnkey, and you have the ability to be able to get that book from us.
Yeah, if you want to text, I have the number here. If you want to text 415-52, text Active Turnkey to the number 415-528-7403. We'll get that book out to you. Again, if you text Active Turnkey to Turnkey to 415-528-7403. Hopefully you guys got that.
So wait a minute, do they text Active Turnkey?
They text Turnkey.
Text Turnkey.
Turnkey.
So TURNKEY.
Correct.
So
That's
text
correct spelling.
Turnkey to 514-528-7403, and you will be sent a free copy of my Active Turnkey book, The Best Way to Buy Rentals.
A couple more things. First of all, if you are an investor and you know somebody who's looking to get into turnkey rentals, and either you've bought from us before or you think that what we have to offer is of good value, we do have a referral program, and we can definitely get you interested in that. So you can reach out to me again at jared@byolsongroup.com, and if you know people who are interested, we can help you with that. And then again, he mentioned our buyers list, so those are things that we can help you with. So
I mean, if this podcast has brought you value and you thought to yourself, man, this is good, share this with your friends. If you're watching this on social media, click share, click subscribe. And if you do us a favor and just give this podcast a 5-star rating, it would really help our message and be able to help us get this message out to other people as well. I am really trying to help the city of Gary, Indiana, and we are trying to bring business here. We are trying to build community here, and there's some things that we're doing here that I don't think I could do anywhere else, and I believe that it's part of my mission here on Earth, and I would love for you to be a part of it.
We appreciate you joining us today. Thank you for joining us. Active Turnkey,
the best way to buy rentals.
Thanks, guys. Olson Group Network makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast should not be considered professional advice. Unless specifically stated otherwise, Olson Group Network does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement. Any third-party materials or content of any third-party site referenced in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions, standards, or policies of Olson Group Network. Olson Group Network assumes no responsibility or liability for the accuracy or completeness of the content contained in third-party materials or on third-party sites referenced in this podcast, or the compliance with the applicable laws of such materials and/or links referenced herein.